Alright, hopefully you guys are sitting there comfortably and prepared to enjoy the philosophy. And today we will be talking about Immanuel Kant and Critique of Pure Reason. This is actually something which is absolutely necessary as an introduction to modern philosophy. Critique of Pure Reason is one of those books which completely changed the way we look at ourselves and we look at the world around us. Ever since it was first published and the first edition came out in 1781, the world of philosophy was never the same. We do call the period before Kant's critique pre-Kantian philosophy and the period after post-Kantian philosophy, and there is a good reason for that, and hopefully you will be able to see why. Eventually we will go over German idealism, in particular Hegel. I have written my thesis on Hegel. I love Hegel and I have a lot to say about him. And then we will talk about Schopenhauer, who hated Hegel and who definitely has a different look at essentially the same thing. Both of them in some way reacted to Kant. So understanding of Kant is essential in order to understand either Hegel or Schopenhauer. Then of course, after Hegel, it is almost impossible not to talk about Marx. And Marx today is one of those hot topics which everybody is interested in. So hopefully we can talk about Marx and you guys can understand what is still relevant in Marx and what is kind of outdated, what can we possibly take from Marx which is important for us today or in the future, and what perhaps is not no longer as important, even though still somewhat interesting. And then we'll talk about existentialism, which is one of the perhaps most exciting currents in philosophy. In a way, existentialism again came out of Kant's philosophy and was somewhat of a reaction to Hegel's philosophy, as you will see. There are two different currents in existentialism. One of them, Kierkegaard's current, would be a lot more religious, and the other one, Nietzsche, taken off after Nietzsche, is very, very secular. In fact, anti-religious, to the point of almost hatred for religion. But, again, in order to get there, we need to go through Kant. We need to understand Kant. We need to understand Critique of Pure Reason in particular, and it will probably take more than one lecture. But we do have to go over it, because if we don't understand that, it is difficult to understand where everything else begins. Now, prior to getting into the critique though, and this is one of the things with philosophy, there are a lot of things which need to be mentioned. We're not going to mention all of them. However, some of them are crucially important. Well, first of all, we have to remind ourselves who was Nicolaus Copernicus, because Kant compares himself with Copernicus. He's saying that his revolution in philosophy is similar to the revolution produced by Copernicus. Now, what was specifically, what did Copernicus introduce into scientific world? Well, this is something we take for granted today, really. The idea that the Earth is not the center of the universe. Now, prior to Copernicus, we used to think that the Earth is at the center. This is so-called Ptolemaic model. The Sun was supposed to revolve around the Earth, as well as all the other planets, and then, of course, the stars. Now, that created kind of a problem, because when people looked at the planets, and as we now very well know, they actually do not revolve around the Earth, they revolve around the Sun. What happens is, when you look at the sky, you will see them making these kind of weird loops. So if you have a model like this, it is pretty difficult to explain why exactly are these planets going in this weird loopy type of fashion. What is going on? Now, Copernicus was the first one who actually suggested to put the sun and not the earth at the center. And the reason for that was that if you do put the sun at the center and then assume that the earth revolves around the sun, then everything actually makes sense. Then the other planets also revolve around the sun very peacefully on their own respective orbits. And you no longer have to account for these weird loopy movements. Now, in a way, what Kant did is similar to that. And we'll talk about it in due time. So this is an important first point to understand. The second point is the work of David Hume. David Hume is essential because the whole critique, in a way, is an attempt to answer Hume. So in order to understand what Hume was about, we need to go a little bit into his philosophy. We're not going to go too deeply, but there's a couple of things which we need to know. And in particular, if you ever heard about David Hume, probably one of the most famous things you would have heard is his critique of the idea of law of causation, causality. Now, what exactly did Hume say about causality? Well, he said that the several things are necessary in order to serve as a foundation for our causal judgments. In particular, one thing which is required for two things to cause each other is contiguity of them in space. They should be somewhere touching each other. So, for example, if I want to push this marker, my hand has to touch the marker. Something like that. Contiguity. The second thing is required priority in time. In order for something to be cause of something else, it has to come before that other thing. The third thing is constant conjunction. Every single time we observe one thing, we should observe the other. If there are some exceptions to this, then perhaps there's no causal connection between them. Finally, the probably most important thing is a necessary connection between these events. Necessity. One of them necessarily has to cause the other. That is something which Hume said we actually do not observe. We assume it. And this is an important point because usually people do take it for granted that one thing causes the other thing. However, how often do we question, from the logical point of view, is this really necessary? Is there any possibility, for example, if I let this marker go, it will not fall on the ground? Now, note that we all know the law of gravity, and we know that if I will let it go, it will actually fall. Oh, it did. However, is there any logical necessity? Strictly speaking, is there any possibility at all that the marker does not fall on the ground? And the correct answer is yes, of course. It does fall on the ground. We know that from experience. However, can we be absolutely beyond any reasonable doubt sure that every single time it will do that? And the answer is no. We cannot be sure. We only assume that. And this is crucially important because from Hume's point of view, we are making a leap here. We are saying something which we should not say, something which we should not be so sure about, because in order for us to be sure that one thing actually does cause the other, we have to have more than just observation of that constantly happening. Hume's point was that what we actually do is we use custom or habit. We habitually used to the idea that one thing causes the other, and therefore we assume that that happens out of necessity, whereas in reality that's just a coincidence every single time. Our mind cannot find necessity in these events. Now this is one of the most important things to understand about where Kant is starting from. Kant read Hume, and he actually was significantly impressed. And he thought, perhaps I should look a little bit deeper into that and try to find out. And this is more or less what the critique of pure reason have started from. That point. Hume's famous skepticism about what can we know? Can we really know the points of necessity? Now a few words about Kant himself. His life was not awfully exciting. He was born in 1724, attended school at Königsberg, his hometown, attended University of Königsberg, then he became professor at the University of Königsberg. He never in his life left Königsberg. He was never married, didn't have any children, led peaceful, quiet life in Königsberg, and taught variety of subjects at the University of Königsberg, including metaphysics, logic, ethics, aesthetics, philosophical theology, mathematics, physics, geography, and anthropology. Lots of subjects. So he was very, very versatile. He knew a lot of things about a lot of things. Excruciatingly knowledgeable and smart man. Now, Kant himself began as what is known as rationalist. Rationalism and empiricism, this is somewhat of an anachronistic modern way to distinguish philosophy. However, we're still using it and it does make some sense. Rationalists are more or less philosophers who believe that you can get to things and understand things with the use of reason alone. Whereas empiricists, mainly British philosophers, including Locke and Hume, the ones who believe that everything has to be based on experience. There is really nothing there which we can get to through reason alone. Reason does not give us enough to understand things. There is really no foundation in our mind when we're born other than what we acquire throughout our life as a result of experience, and therefore empiria or senses is what gives us everything we know and everything we understand about the world around us. So Kant began as a rationalist. So he believed to begin with that there is a particular structure in our mind, structure in us, which is there already when we are born. And this structure is what helps us to go through life. However, later he started having some doubts. As he himself described it, Hume was the one who woke him up from this dogmatic slumber. Now, in the beginning of the critique, Kant talks about avoiding dogmatism and skepticism. They are the two dangerous rocks which we can see on both sides of philosophical current. One of them, dogmatism, is assuming that things are the way they are without a proper foundation, thinking that we can get to things through reasoning alone. And this is, according to him, is a dangerous thing, because reason can lead us in a wrong direction. On the other hand, the other extreme would be skepticism, not believing reason at all, thinking that we cannot use reason whatsoever to understand things, to understand reality. So one of the goals of the critique was to look at the reason, which is why the book is called Critique of Pure Reason. What does Kant mean by pure reason? Reason without any experience. Reason as it is in our mind. The pure reason, what can it do and what can it not do? In a way, you can think about it in like this. He was looking at our mental software and trying to understand what are the limitations of it. What can it possibly know? What is it by itself? The nooks and crannies of our mind. And this is essentially the goal of the critique, to figure it out. One of the problems which he obviously could see at the time was, with advance of science, people started discarding metaphysics whatsoever, thinking that the most important questions about reality cannot be answered at all. And one of the reasons for that was that all the previous attempts to answer these most important questions about God, questions about reality, were kind of looking less and less appealing. People are thinking that perhaps God is just a concept. There is no such thing as the soul. And that was leading to a dangerous area where you would think that morality is all relative and therefore anything is allowed. So it was becoming more and more obvious that society moves away from God and moves away from morality. Now, it will get to its extreme with Nietzsche, but even Kant was well aware of this trend, and one of the goals of the critique was to try to not so much revive metaphysics, but give it a new foundation. Try to see whether it can be built as a science rather than just a pure speculation about things we don't know anything about. One of the goals was to develop a new understanding of knowledge that would combine the strong sides of empiricism and rationalism. So, in other words, all these previous discussions between philosophers about whether or not there's something in our mind when we are born, the ideas of rationalism, or everything we get comes from experience and we are born as a clean slate, there's nothing in there, which would be the empiricist position. Kant was trying to find a middle way between that. In the same time, he was trying to reconcile religion, morality, and human freedom. Because one of the important questions therein, if you look at the world from purely scientific point of view, it does seem like everything is determined. Everything we do is determined by some other physical law. And therefore, the question has started to arise, is there even such a thing as freedom? Perhaps freedom is just our own invention. There's no freedom. Everything we do is determined. But what is the danger about that? The danger about that is, of course, then you may think, well, can we really blame anybody for anything? Can we accuse somebody of doing something which we think is morally not allowed, such as murder, for example? If somebody murders somebody, can we say that that person actually could have chosen not to do that? Or, using strict determinism, do we have to actually say, well, that those are the physical and psychological laws which has determined that person? We cannot blame him or her because that is all part of these determined laws which make people do things even if they don't want to. So Kant was trying to answer this question in the best way he could, and we will see how interesting his answer is. So all of this was what drove him to write the critique. Now, Copernican revolution. At the beginning of the book, Kant does compare himself to a Copernicus. Now, let's see, what did he mean exactly? What is his Copernican revolution? How did he change things from the way they were before? Okay, so prior to Kant's critique, the traditional view of pretty much all the philosophers was that the way our mind is related to the world is there are objects and we just receive some information. We are getting those objects into our mind with the help of the senses. And so our goal is to make sure that this is actually corresponding to the objects as they actually are, right? We are trying to learn the world and understand the world the way it is. One of the biggest questions which arisen even as far back as ancient Greece and which has never been fully resolved is, how do we know? How do we know what the world actually is the way we perceive it? There are different ways to answer these questions. Now, if you watch the movie The Matrix, you saw that the idea there is that people actually can be swimming in some sort of a liquid and be fed a particular information into their brain and not know what the reality is. the reality as it is was they were swimming in this liquid, but they were given information by those agents that they are doing all sorts of things, they're living in some sort of virtual reality and so on. That actually has foundation in philosophy. The question in philosophy is it possible that things actually are kind of like that we not get in the world as it is, instead we get in some sort of distorted picture. Now, René Descartes was one of the foundational figures of modern philosophy who has tried to answer this question in the following way. He tried to question everything and say, well, suppose everything is a dream, suppose everything is a lie. Well, there's just one thing at least which I'm pretty sure about. I exist, right? I must be somewhere because I am the one who is wondering about these things, who is thinking. Okay, but that still leaves the question though, does the world around us exist? And the way Descartes answered it, he said, well, I know one more thing. I know that God exists. And since God exists, he serves as a warrantor of everything. He would never lie to me. He would not be a liar. Why would he deceive me? Because he is absolutely good and perfect being, and the good and perfect being would never lie to me. So he explained the existence of objects in this way. Following Descartes, one of the other interesting figures would be John Locke, the English philosopher John Locke, who did try to look at it from more of a scientific common sense point of view. John Locke's view of reality can be called representative realism. He was saying that things are indeed real. There are real objects everywhere. However, we do not have direct access to them. We only have access to ideas in our mind, representations of this world. And so for this reason, next philosopher of note, George Berkeley, has actually taken him on. George Berkeley was a bishop. He believed in God, and he tried to defend religion in a way by suggesting very interesting theory. He was saying, well, Locke is right. All we have is the ideas in our mind. For all we know, the world may not even be there at all. And that doesn't matter, because God could be giving us the idea of the world straight into our mind. He disagreed in a way with Descartes because he didn't think it was a lie. His point was, well, in order for it to be a lie, remember the Matrix? In the Matrix, those people were actually swimming in some sort of a liquid. So Locke was saying, well, if you are swimming in a liquid and you are fed this wrong idea about the world, then you are being lied to. But what if the world is the entire idea? There's nothing but the idea. There's no liquid. You're not swimming anywhere. In that case, that is not a lie. The world is just the idea. And that's pretty much all there is to it. Now Hume, who was the next one, rightfully said, using common sense, that yes, we can never dispel that. We can never be sure that the world is not just an idea. However, what we can do is disregard it. Why do we have to have this absolute certainty? We can never have absolute certainty, which is why he's known as a skeptic. We can never have the absolute certainty. So for this reason, we shouldn't even care. It doesn't affect us in our everyday life. We still get up in the morning, we still go to work, we still enjoy a good drink with friends, even if it's all an idea. Well, what's the difference? So when we get to Kant, Kant actually reacts to all that. And next time we will talk about more specifically how does he answer this challenge. For now, I think we will just leave it at that. This is the idea, this is the background to the critique. And let's move on next time.